Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock. Thomas Miller here. We have a question that we're going to tackle that kind of falls into one of the areas that astrology gets the most requested questions. And this is around kids and children, which is one of the broader areas, but specifically about getting pregnant so that you can have kids. Robert, does astrology have anything to tell us and show us about when a woman might best consider getting pregnant?
Yeah, it really does, Thomas. The birth chart itself will show you the proclivity toward having children. Especially in a woman's chart, you're talking about the condition of the sun and the moon, and the birth chart, the condition of her fifth house of children in general. And the birth chart may, in fact, show difficulties, either conceiving or delivering and so on. Sometimes it will. I had a couple once who'd been trying IVF, in vitro. They'd tried it twice, and it's not cheap. And we're still unable to conceive. And the wife happened to have her birth certificate. She was so determined to find. And I asked her about some tubular difference. And anyway, I wound up telling her, I said, why don't you guys quit trying for a while? Don't try IVS for a while. I really think that you might get pregnant in June. And it was only 2 or 3 months away. And sure enough, they did. So the birth chart is a place to start. But if you want to maybe determine the sex of a child before, if you want to conceive on a date that will give you a boy or give you a girl, there is a method that Linda Goodman introduced me to back in the, I guess, early 70s. By a Dr. Eugen Jonas, Jonas, who was a Czech physician. And basically the theory of this is uses a woman's chart. Every month, the sun and the moon position will be identical in terms of number of degrees of separation between the sun and the moon, identical to the angle that they were in at birth. So let's say at birth in a woman's chart, her sun is 60 degrees ahead of the moon. So the moon, let's say, is at 0 Aries. Her sun will be at 0 Gemini. So that's a 60-degree separation, with the moon being behind the sun in the zodiac. So every month, all through her fertile period in life, every month when the sun is exactly 60 degrees ahead of the moon, or since the moon moves faster, let's say the moon reaches 60 degrees behind the sun of the zodiac, she will be fertile on that day. You can get it down to the hour if you want. And then you take 24 hours on either side of the date that the sun-moon aspect is exactly the same as it was at birth. And she will be fertile during that 24-hour period, or 48. Sometime, and the moon, the sign that the moon is in on that fertile day, will determine whether it's a masculine or feminine sign, whether it's a boy or a girl. The moon may change signs, and that is where it gets to be really tricky. Sometimes you can't determine the sex, but that's the method. And in my experience, it actually worked. I am a skeptic by nature, as you know, but I tried it. And it worked every time. And in one case, it worked in terms of predicting the sexes of a child from pregnancy. It also, once I recall very well, an actor, a television star's wife had come to me for exactly this. She wanted to know if she was pregnant and wanted to know if astrology could tell her, a boy or girl. And so I asked her, how far along are you? And she told me, and I looked it up in the ephemeris, and I said, well, you couldn't have gotten pregnant on that day. Let me ask you this. There was a period, it was actually about a week before this. Were you and your husband out of town on a trip of some kind? And she said, oh my God, yes, we were in DC. And I said, that's when you got pregnant, because that was her fertile day, you see. And sure enough, it again proved to be accurate. So again, I don't get many requests these days. People are not in childbearing years, really. Or they've already got children. But I'm trying to think, the last time I did this was for a couple. They had already 2 daughters. They lived off the coast of Seattle and on an island. They already had these children. They wanted to know, because I think I was reading for her, and I mentioned, because I've read for him as well, I mentioned to her, it looks like you guys are thinking about getting pregnant next year, are you? And she said, yeah, we are, in fact. And so she either that or she was already pregnant. I'm trying to, but she said, we really want a boy. We've already got the girls. Well, I said, I hate to tell you, it looks like it's going to be another girl. And it was. So every time I have used this, as I say, I don't get much call for it anymore. But when I do get called for it, there's the method. And in my experience, it actually has worked.
That's phenomenal. Thank you for sharing this. You mentioned at the beginning when you were talking about this, about how the natal chart can indicate the tendencies of fertility. Can you explain that more?
Yeah, in a nutshell, for example, the water and earth signs are fertile signs, just as an overview. Scorpio is a water sign, but it also, unfortunately, carries with it this potential I stress, for serious conditions, including miscarriage and death. But it's a potential. So then you have to begin to look at the aspects between the planets, the sun and the moon in particular, the planets in the fifth house, the sign on the fifth house. Capricorn is an earth sign. It also presupposes problems with conceiving or delivering, just because it's ruled by Saturn. Now, Saturn may be very well aspected in the chart, which means it'll go fine. But so you have to be able to read the natal chart to get the proclivity to have children to begin with. And then these outer planets absolutely will show up in things. I had read for a client, Thomas, I'd been reading, she never knew her birth time for 40 years. And had become friends, of course, by then. She had 3 children, and she had moved to Florida. And I saw her about 6 years ago, about a year before she died, actually. And ironically, after all those years, she had finally gotten her time of birth in the strangest way I ever heard of. I won't go into that. But for the first time in 40 years, I was able to set up a real birth chart. And oddly enough, her ascendant and my ascendant were within 2 degrees of each other. So no wonder we'd become such great friends. But I remembered then, for the first time, I had a time birth chart. And I said, let me add. And by the way, at the moment I was with her in Florida for about a week, her son, her oldest son, was dying in Los Angeles of liver cancer. So now I had the time birth chart, and I said, let me ask you about Alan's birth. This was her first child. Was he a breech birth? And she said, yes, it was incredibly difficult. He was born feet first. He didn't want to come out. He never did want, and we talked about this, he never did want to leave his mother. He never married. He was straight, and in fact, he had just found a girlfriend at 50. And unfortunately, he worked for a printer, and he had inhaled a lot of these chemicals, and this is how he'd gotten the liver cancer. I think, plus he was also by that point an alcoholic and so on. But we got into past lives in that. But the one detail about was he a breached birth? Now that I had her birth chart, I wanted to confirm that it was Uranus retrograde in her 4th house, the house of her first child. So and when she said yes, then I began to read the reincarnation from that chart and explained. It was astonishing to me, and of course to her as well, because it was a lifetime in Russia. She was a nun in Russia, and she had had an affair with a Russian Orthodox priest and was ultimately driven from the convent in St. Petersburg in Russia. And I can't remember if Alan was the priest or was the child, but it was one of those things. Oh, no, I remember it now. They were brother and sister in this life. They were brother and sister. Oh, my God, yes, it comes back. She was a nun in a convent, and she got kicked out. And there was a war in which he had promised to save her, and he couldn't. She died, and he never, ever got over that. So in this life, he didn't want to be born because it was a separation from her. So he was born feet first. He didn't want to leave her. And by the way, she was Jewish in this life. Where did her parents come from? St. Petersburg, Russia. Not only was she Jewish in this life, but she did a lot of work for St. Jude Hospital. She was a writer. And she traveled to Moscow several times in connection with that St. Jude and stayed in Russia. And her son, Alan, was obsessed with war. He collected war figurines and all figures and all of that. So from the time he was a small child. So there were all those kinds of confirming details once I had a real time of birth.
That's an amazing story. Wow. To get all of that unlocked from the chart. Incredible.
Well,
Absolutely incredible.
Thomas, for me and for her too, her son was dying, and she was most concerned would she get there in time to say goodbye to him, really. But it just hearing this story from her horoscope gave her closure, gave me closure. But it gave her closure. And then the details, which I had no way of knowing, that her parents came from and she's living in Tampa, up the block from St. Petersburg. It's just the ironies of all. And then to hear that Alan was obsessed with war and all of those little confirming details, once again, it just reaffirms this connection between our horoscopes and the solar system and us.
Yeah, that's just fascinating. Totally incredible. Thank you so much for this. Hope that this helps those of you who are in those years and would like to implement this. Wow, some incredibly valuable knowledge. If you'd like to talk to Robert, his contact information is right there in the show notes, along with our YouTube channel link and our Discord channel as well. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock.